All right, so now it's time for the next installment in my heavy metal album reviews, musical album reviews, and for today's episode, I'm going to be reviewing the excellent band Metallica, which is one of my personal favorite bands of all time. Metallica is kind of a controversial band in the sense that they've had some very strange things happen to them in their career, with the whole load and reload thing, and they've been up and down, and they've been gone from the heaviest band to the not so heaviest band, and but you know what though, their mark on the musical industry is unmatched and unparalleled, and they're definitely one of the most important bands, metal or non-metal, to ever exist in all time. So I'm going to go through their albums in order from worst to first, and give you my thoughts and feelings on the super excellent heavy metal band Metallica. So so here we go. Alright, so clocking in is what I consider to be the worst Metallica album of all time, is without a doubt, unquestionably, Saint Anger. Saint Anger was an extremely disappointing album for Metallica fans, in my opinion, because Metallica fans had already been kind of disappointed with the whole load-reload era, and not to mention how many years it took to get their albums out and stuff. And and then there was some excitement when Saint Anger was going to come out. There was a lot of talk about, Metallica's going to go back to their roots, and they're going to be back like how they used to be, and it's going to be great and stuff. And then you popped it in, and you were really, I was ready to forgive them for just about anything if they could just give me a Metallica album. And instead, we got Saint Anger. The most notable aspect of Saint Anger is the snare drum. I don't know what they were thinking, or I guess they were trying to be different. Sometimes when you try to be different, it pays off and it works out great, but in this case, it kind of backfired, because the entire album, as you listen to it, you can't really pay any attention to the song structure or the writing, because the whole time, all you can listen to is that weird snare drum, and why does it sound so strange? It's out of tune, like it's broken sounding. And yeah, so Saint Anger is definitely the worst Metallica album. Okay, next up on my list is Metallica's Reload album. This album was really, I don't know, it's just another album in Metallica's kind of down period. They had a period where they just sounded burned out and tired. Now, one thing I will say about Reload is it is light years ahead of Saint Anger. This is good music on a good album, honestly, and the main reason that this album and Load gets such a negative review from Metallica fans is because of the great albums that came before. And so if you forget the previous Metallica catalog and just listen to this album just by itself, I mean, it is good music, and they got some good songs on here and stuff. And Reload and Load for me are almost kind of like a double album. They're almost kind of like really the same album, because the feel is so similar between the two. I just like Reload a little bit less than Load. I think that the flow is a little bit more repetitive, and it just the ideas just seemed a little burned out and tired, with a few exceptions on here. I will say I love the Unforgiven sequel that is on this album, and I also love Where the Wild Things Are. I think is an excellent song on this album. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Reload. Okay, next up on our list is Load from Metallica. This album is actually a good album. There's a lot of good music on it. It's got some real groovy feels to it. There's actually some killer songs on this album, but this album gets kind of negative reviews, mainly, again, just because of how good Metallica's previous catalog had been. I'll never forget the first time listening to this album. Me and my buddy Tim had gone and gotten the new Metallica album. We're chilling in his car, and we're all excited. We're like, yeah, the new Metallica album, this is going to be awesome. And then we throw it in, and it was, nowhere near as heavy as what had been on the Black album or Justice or Masters or Ride the Lightning or any of those. and it was basically blues with distortion, and it started a period of about 10 years where I was just absolutely prejudiced against just about everything that Metallica had put out. In retrospect, I actually enjoy this album now, and although I skip some tracks, I do throw this album on from time to time when I'm in the mood for some more chillin' Metallica. Out of the 3 strange experimental Metallica albums, I would say this is the best of the 3 experimental Metallica albums. So. Okay, next up on my list is 1990's self-titled Metallica album. Most Metallica fans call this album the Black Album. You know, at the time when this album came out, I absolutely loved it, and I thought it was a killer album. But in retrospect, I can now see that this was kind of the beginning of the decline for Metallica. It's the one that came out after Injustice for All. They got Bob Rock as their producer, and it's got a very polished and kind of organized, media-friendly sound to it. This is the album that really made a lot of non-metal heads began to like Metallica. And I'll never forget back in high school going into the weight room where all the jocks were lifting weights and getting strong and stuff, and they had Metallica playing and just being like, whoa, the jocks are listening to Metallica? What's going on here? And so, I mean, this album, it's not a bad album. It's got some great songs on it. It's got some cheesy songs on it. I don't know. Overall, it's a pretty good album, but certainly they've got better albums than this one. All right, next up on my list is going to be Metallica's Hardwired to Self-Destruct. This is Metallica's newest album, and yep, I'm sorry guys, this one's overrated. A lot of folks say that this one's just as good as their old stuff, and then, I mean, don't get me wrong, this is a great album. There's some great tunes on here. I especially love Dream No More. It's almost like the sequel to The Thing That Should Not Be, and Atlas Rise is an excellent song, and Moth to the Flame is an excellent song, and this I would say is probably the first album on my list that is officially a good Metallica album, solid and stuff, but it doesn't make it up as high as some of their older stuff because there's still some skipper tracks. There's still some filler tracks. I mean, there's still, I still can't put this album in and listen to it from start to finish and get that fulfilling, satisfied Metallica experience like I can with their first 4 albums. So although I love this album, I do have to say, I think it's overrated, and I personally don't think it's going to stand the test of time. All right, so next up on my list is Death Magnetic. For me, this was the album that started the current Metallica comeback. This was after the release of the Saint Anger thing, and I just really after the release of Load, I kind of got out of Metallica completely. I just figured they were dead, and then one day my buddy Tim came over and he said, man, you got to listen to the new Metallica album. And I was like, I don't believe it. I've heard over and over again how they're going to come back and they're going to be this great band again. And I just didn't believe it. I did not have faith. But yeah, I'll never forget listening to this album with my buddy Tim and loving it. And I've heard some people say that the new Hardwired to Self-Destruct album is better than Death Magnetic. And I don't agree. Death Magnetic is one of 5 Metallica albums that I can put in the player, hit the play button, and not skip any track, and listen to it from start to finish and enjoy. I do think out of the 5 that I mentioned, I think it's the worst one, but I think it's excellent. It's the sequel to Injustice for All that we never got. After Injustice for All came out, began Metallica's commercial "let's make money" phase, and Death Magnetic is almost like the direct sequel to Injustice for All for me. So yeah, I really dig this album. I love Death Magnetic. Good album. Okay, next up on my list is Metallica's 3rd album, The Master of Puppets. I know some people that consider this to be Metallica's best album, but I gotta say, out of their 4 super excellent albums, this album is super excellent, by the way. I don't mean to take anything away from it. This album is absolutely great. But out of the 4 absolutely great Metallica albums, this one is the bottom for me. This one This one, their sound is just a little bit overly refined, and there's a couple. I skipped Leper Messiah. I think that song is. I don't really like that song, but other than that, I love every single song on this album, and this is definitely one of the greatest heavy metal albums of all time. Master of Puppets. Next up on my list is Metallica's Kill 'Em All. And this one arguably might even maybe should be higher on the list. When this came out in 1983, it was absolutely mind-blowing and bone-crushing and completely changed the face of heavy metal and music in general as we know it. And there's a lot of things that people who enjoy metal take for granted that really came about because of this super excellent first Metallica album. And the only reason that this album doesn't rank higher is it's just a little bit disjointed. I remember my first version of it was on tape, and it had a couple cover songs that I didn't realize were cover songs, like Blitzkrieg was the last song on side A, and then of course there's Am I Evil, which was on side B, and then later those songs got removed because they're not actually Metallica songs and they're covers. And so if you remove those songs, this album loses the flow a little bit. And honestly, I'm a little bit burned out on the Four Horsemen and Mold Our Breath. But what's super excellent about this album is just the raw ferocity and power. And I love the way that James Hetfield's voice cracks as he screams because he's got so much passion and stuff. And it's just an extremely passionate, heartfelt album. One of the greatest heavy metal albums of all time. Next up on my list is Metallica's Ride the Lightning, 1984, the sequel to Kill 'Em All. And this album almost made my number one slot. I actually think that, all things being considered, this album probably in reality is the best Metallica album. The only reason that this one doesn't make the number one slot for me is because I just have a nostalgic love for the other album that does make the number one slot for me. And so, based on my emotions, this album ends up making number two. But if I were to take my emotions out of it and just look at the beauty and greatness of this album, just how eloquently it is composed and put together, the beautiful flow. I mean, there's just so much great stuff on here, whether it be Creeping Death or Fade to Black or For Whom the Bell Tolls, Fight Fire with Fire. Ride the Lightning is... in fact, Ride the Lightning is their best title track out of all their albums, and one of the coolest songs ever written. Escape is a killer song. Trapped Under Ice is a killer song. Call of Cthulhu is a killer song. Did I just name every song on this album? Yeah, I did. Every song on this album is absolutely either an A or an A+. This album is just... I can't overstate enough how great this album is, and how, if your heart beats and your ears function, you should pick up this album and listen to it and bang your head to it, because it's going to make your life better. Metallica, Ride the Lightning. And now it's time for what I consider to be the greatest Metallica album of all time. Not only the greatest Metallica album, but arguably one of the top 5 greatest musical albums or heavy metal albums of all time, and that is 1988's And Justice for All from Metallica. I have a story with this album. This album really hits home with me and just absolutely touches my heart. I'll never forget, there was a friend of mine named Tina who was giving away a whole bunch of tapes, and she gave me this tape with no writing on it. It was completely black, and you couldn't read what was on it, and I didn't know what it was, and she didn't know what it was. Anyway, so she was giving away a bunch of tapes, and I brought it home, and I threw it in, and I listened to this album. Oh my God, and it was absolutely mind-blowing to me. It was the most incredible music I'd ever heard, especially the first song, Blackened. I'd never heard anything like it in my entire life, and I didn't even know what it was. And I listened to it over and over and over again for like a year, until finally one day watching MTV, Metallica's One came on, and I was like, hey, I know that song, and that's what I realized, that I'd been listening to Metallica's And Justice for All. Also, at the time, I was learning to play guitar, And a friend of mine from my baseball team, his name was Mike, taught me how to read tablature and sheet music. And the very first song that I learned with tablature and sheet music was One from Metallica. So this album completely changed my life, for better or for worse, for the rest of all time. And Lars Ulrich's drumming on this is unparalleled. If you listen to any Metallica album, he never reaches the pinnacle. This is his best drumming album. The feel and the accuracy that he plays is just brutally devastating. The guitar harmonies are out of this world beautiful harmonies. James Hetfield's singing is that perfect balance of singing notes but also growling with enough feel and strength. And then there's like a darkness to this album. I mean, this is the album that was released immediately after Cliff Burton was killed, the bass player Cliff Burton. And so on the one hand, they turned the bass of the new bass player way down. And a lot of people don't like this album because you can't hear the bass very well. But for me, it almost felt like a whole. It's got this like, oh man, it's hard to explain, but it's just got this sad, sorrowful, broken-hearted hopelessness feeling to it. It's one of the most incredible musical, artistic creations of all time. In my opinion, And Justice for All is the best Metallica album and one of the greatest musical albums ever created. I absolutely love this album. I cannot overstate how much I love it. To this day, I'm not sick of it. I've been listening to it for, 30 years or whatever, and I still pop it in, and I'm still like, yeah, every time I hear this album. This album is just sick. It is absolutely sick. I love And Justice for All. Greatest Metallica album of all time. So there you have it, folks. Now you know what I think of Metallica's albums from worst to first. Quick mention here, I was almost going to include Garage Days Revisited, the EP that's really half an album, except that album's all covers, so I didn't include it. However, I do have to say I also totally love that album too, and I enjoy banging my head to that one. But so let me know what you think in the comments. Do you agree with my list? Do you disagree with my list? Go ahead and let me know what you think are the best Metallica albums of all time, and let the words fly. Thanks for watching. Have a blessed day.